We have some half an hour for debate. Without trying to summarize the richness of all these interventions, I'll just highlight 2 or 3 points which I think are fundamental. We've heard that obviously we have still as one of the tall challenges to be addressed by international public finance, poverty reduction or poverty eradication. But on top of that, the new SDG agenda is adding issues around structural transformation and global public goods, including, but not only, climate finance. Quantitatively, as Romilly has told us, international public finance is still very important, and it's likely, because of the increasing number of challenges for these type of funds to address, it's likely to increase the need for this type of finance. So basically, the main questions are the purposes, the modalities, all the new, but very importantly, as both Michael and Martin have mentioned, the politics and the governance behind it are going to be very important. The first question that we have received from Chennai Mukumba from CAT is what might be some of the implications of the growing number of multilateral financing institutions that have resulted partly due to the lack of voice of developing countries, I assume, in existing institutions. So this is one. I'm going to take 3 or 4 more. So we have one there, one here, a third one. So we'll take this to start with.
Yes, okay. Thank you. I'm Chiro Yamamoto, a representative of JICA to the European Union based in Brussels. May I react to the Romilly's nice graphic illustration, water, oil versus water, sugar. I'm a sort of ancient aid worker. I have been preached and taught that ODA should be the obligation of rich countries, and not just the financing instrument. So in that context, I like the oil and water model. That means I want ODA should remain as a residual, obligational part of aid as a residual without being diluted by other flow of resources. Thank you.
The one back there.
Much. There's a point I wanted to make in the last session, but it applies equally to this one, and I want to make it because when I do the summary of today's discussion tomorrow, I want to be able to stand up and say a really important point was made in the discussion, and then I can cite it. And it's really a point made by both Gail and Michael that delivering the SDGs to 2030 is absolutely not about business as usual and doing more poverty reduction and being a little bit climate compatible on the way. It is actually about delivering major transformations in the economies of all the countries we deal with, including the poor ones. And that requires an entirely new approach by everybody who deals with both public and private finance. And actually, the people from the last session who deal with public revenue raising are the crusaders of a new approach to public finance. And we need to go on the offensive and not be simply doing business as usual. And just not to bang on about climate, but we have to decarbonize the entire world economy to 0 CO2, not just a bit of CO2, 0 CO2 by 2065. There will be massive changes in the structures of all the economies we deal with. And furthermore, we will have to deal with many countries losing the revenue that they currently get from stranded assets in coal, oil and gas. And there are many countries we've been talking about today which derive most of their tax revenue from taxing natural resources. So I just want to I don't know whether it's a question or not, but is it true that public finance is going to have to be the new crusade for delivering a transformed economy? And how do we shake the potential complacency that might exist out in the real world about the extent of the change we have to deliver?
Thank you very much for all your presentations. I just want to touch on something that was mentioned earlier today. So when Annalisa went through some of the evidence regarding development progress in regards to the MDGs, there seemed to be a clear pattern that as there was a shift of expenditure away from households and towards public finance, whether that be government or whether that be international public finance. That was where there seemed to be the greatest gains made in development. And so I guess I just wanted to ask the panel on their thoughts in terms of going forward. Do you see this same trend being necessary? And will there be a continued role or maybe even greater emphasis for the government and international public finance to bring about these development outcomes?
Thanks. So we'll go back to the panel now. Romilly, on airline sugar.
Thank you, and I agree with the colleague from JICA. I wanted to make 3 points. First, I do think with the climate and the development agenda, absolutely agree with everything that's been said about how we bring these together. I still have an outstanding question around allocation of IPF and what does it really mean? And I don't think we've bottomed that out actually in ODI, because some of us think, well, let's not allocate ODA, which is essentially the same thing as climate finance. There's a lot of overlap. That shouldn't go to mitigation in middle-income countries. And some of us are saying possibly it should. And I feel like I'd like to have more of a sort of evidence-based reason for that discussion, because I think that is the real critical part of this agenda. It's very easy to say there's poverty needs and there's climate needs and global public good needs, but with essentially a fixed pot of IPF, we're not going to have huge increases. What do we do with it? So that's one question, I think, more for colleagues. In response to the question on the growth of the multilateral institutions responding to the lack of country voice, I personally think more competition is a good thing. And we have done a range of studies looking at how countries, developing countries, are managing the new complex aid landscape and the growth in actors that we know very well, and asking the question, what's the balance between the costs of the additional fragmentation versus the benefits of more competition? And the weight has been very much on the benefits of competition, and countries have said we welcome this additional choice and we like the fact that it enables us to play different donors off against each other. So I think bring it on, essentially, and I think if it forces some of the traditional multilaterals to be more responsive, as you've said, Martin, and have a more fairer governance system in terms of southern countries, then I think that's great. So I think that it's a really positive thing for the aid landscape. In terms of Chris's point, I guess the thing that we don't know from the research that Annalisa presented is we don't know whether there were cases where there was a shift from households to the public sector and it didn't work, because that study is specifically looking at cases where it did work. So it's the normal issue, we don't have a counterfactual. But I nevertheless do think it's a very strong finding. And if, we've looked at a large number of case studies, and if that's what's happening when you're seeing progress, there is this shift to the public sector. That's again something we very much need to bear in mind in this kind of broader debate around the role of different flows.
Martin, do you want to take the point on governance and the proliferation of multilateral organizations?
Yes, as we realize the proliferation of national and regional development banks, for sure we will have a point in time that we will need a certain coordination scenario where those banks and institutions can at least coordinate what they are doing. For now, that coordination is being made inside the countries. In that sense, it's good what Romilly says about competition. Countries now have more instruments to choose with whom and how they will do their policies. But those countries are perhaps losing space in the traditional financial institution, not because the proliferation of the banks is the other way around. The proliferation is because they have been losing or never have a position of power in those institutions.
Gail, Michael, on this is not business as usual, it's a dramatically different approach to development.
Yeah, big issues. I think we're still in a very business as usual mindset. Unfortunately, we're using our international aid budgets to fund global concerns, and is that the right way forward? I'm not sure it is. I mean, we need to fund fundamental structural transformations of our economies over the next, from now. And indeed, some countries, once climate change bites, will probably require long-term fiscal transfers in order to be viable economies. And that raises issues about, how will that be resourced and by whom, and so on. I actually want to, it wasn't raised here, but I want to sort of draw tell a little story about the European Union's experience with regional public finance, because I think this is a useful comparison. I mean, I sit at the UN in New York, and I often hear in international policy discussions, we need to use scarce international aid resources better. And this means, in middle-income countries, they're now wealthier. Do they need aid is, a common question. Can middle-income countries move to non-concessional forms of international public finance? Yes, there may be more poverty there in absolute numbers, but this is a domestic distributional question. Does international public finance have a role? And therefore, low-income countries should be the focus of grants. And in terms of the kinds of things that money funds, it should be social sectors, whereas the productive sectors can support loan finance. Well, within the EU, there is the EU regional, structural and cohesion funds. And they support and they target other high-income countries to promote convergence and wealth creation and job opportunity, the expansion of job opportunities. So they target rich countries with grant finance, it's mostly grant finance, to build infrastructure. And skills development, investments in human capital. And the EU structural and cohesion funds also target poor regions within rich countries. So the argument that poverty is a domestic distributional question, I think that the EU's regional sort of intra-regional aid programme it teaches us that a lot of this is about politics rather than being grounded in, evidence about, always infrastructure can be financed by loan finance. Well, in some small island economies, there will never be an economic case to be made. They will never return a profit. So just to sort of put that on the table, that some of these are political issues rather than sort of grounded in sort of an economic objective analysis.
Just a few comments. Just Simon, so you don't need to cite yourself. I'm happy to say that this is about a very structural transformation. And I think you're absolutely right to focus attention on the internally generated public revenues from this agenda and their risk of loss. So the climate negotiations are not really very complicated. The UNFCCC tries to make them as complicated as possible, but it's basically countries without fossil resources on one side and countries with fossil resources on the other, for unsurprising reasons. And a lot of countries with heavy fossil resources get, as you say, huge amounts of revenues from them, including revenues that you might not think of from them, but from the sale of petrol and diesel. So the UK government has made the Treasury the reason the Treasury believes in congestion charging is because of the reduction in road fuel duty revenues, which are now on a dramatic decline because of the increased efficiency of cars. And road fuel duty, which is a very significant revenue raiser for the British government, is on a very steep decline because cars are getting more efficient and people are not driving them sufficiently more to compensate for that. And that is why the Treasury believes that congestion charging, which would be a consistent source of revenue, which would grow rather than decline, is an appropriate policy. When I was in the Treasury, we used to say it's 10 years away. It's been 10 years away for the last 10 years. And congestion charging may or may not happen, but the entanglement of revenues, of Treasury revenues all around the world with carbon is very, very strong, which is why carbon pricing as an alternative source of revenue is of interest not just to the major economies, not just the European or developed country phenomenon. Many countries are now looking at it, the most recent being Chile, which has now introduced a carbon tax. And there are now a number of countries and regions around the world which are doing it. So there is a very interesting element. Carbon pricing used to be thought of as, this was effectively a mitigation activity. But no, it isn't. It's actually a revenue raiser, and it's a more sustainable revenue raiser in a period when revenues from other carbon sources are on the decline. I'd like to say one thing about governance, which is we should be under no illusions that many of the new development banks and regional development banks are more equally governed and give strong rights to recipient countries and so on, and will have high standards and so on than the existing ones. So the mere competition may or may not generate more opportunities, better governance and better standards and so on. And it will be very interesting, for example, to see how the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the New Development Bank, what kinds of climate commitments, low carbon, climate resilient development strategies they pursue. There is a real risk that as the World Bank and the multilateral development banks move out of coal financing, for example, then the new development banks will come in and substitute with lower environmental standards.
Thank you. I think we have another question here. We'll take 4.
Thanks, Maya King from Queen Mary. Michael, I think you just alluded to the point that I was about to make, so hopefully it's still interesting. Since Romilly mentioned theory, I just wanted to ask about climate finance in relation to, it seems like at the beginning of your talk you were saying, it's a global good, so we need to subsidise it, we need to raise all this money and then spend it. But then actually just recently you were saying, you actually got to think about the revenues and the mitigation strategy and everything. Because that's the thing, if you switch it around and say, instead of reducing carbon as a global public good, you have emitting carbon as the global public bad, then you've just got a new source of financing. And the thing about correcting externalities in that way is that it doesn't matter what you do with the revenue then. Then it's just a source of finance because you've solved the problem by changing the price in the first place. Thanks.
Thanks. We have another one here.
This might be the same question. I've recently heard revived a proposal talking about structural transformation, that every country should have a sort of per capita allowance of carbon, and then finance should be allocated through trading, which would mean the lowest income countries, which emit the least carbon by a large still, would get the most money and everything's sorted. Now, this never seemed very politically likely to me, but I'm just interested to hear if there is any sort of, if that's still anywhere in the debates that are happening.
We'll take 3 more. If you haven't introduced yourself previously, please can you do?
John Burton, KPMG. I had a question really for Michael. Your example sounded very attractive of, when it makes most sense to do the right thing, not just for the environment, but, for a whole variety of reasons, including the economy. Great, but is that the exception or is that the rule? Because to me, some of that sounded a little bit like the exception or, lucky coincidences. But is it not the case that even if we can't quantify it, we know that a lot of poor countries are suffering incremental costs from adaptation and mitigation for them to, follow a clean development path may work if you happen to have a lot of hydropower or whatever in Africa, but it may also, for some countries, actually cost them more. And the danger is, if nobody stumps up any money for that, that we just divert our ODA resources to that, reducing what's left, for the MDGs and the SDGs. And have we really, with your 100 billion, put enough money on the table to tackle that problem? I have my doubts, but do we have a solution, I guess, is my question, and will the Paris negotiations actually tackle that seriously?
Thank you. We have 2 other questions there, and please, if you can be brief so we can make the most of the time left.
Hi, thanks. Mark Bruff, Publish What You Fund. I'm sorry in advance, I'm going to make a point about data, but fortunately we have a cocktail reception coming up, so we can all forget about it quickly. So I like this this definition of IPF as a nice holistic definition which kind of allows us to encompass lots of these different flows. And we've kind of talked about, obviously, also the growing importance of IPF and IFIs and climate finance and South-South cooperation actors. But we also heard earlier around the fact that this multiplicity of donors and instruments is having kind of a negative effect in terms of implications in terms of the fiscal planning for partner countries themselves. And it seems that this is probably likely to worsen with these new actors without more information and greater transparency of these different flows of information. We found from our index that there's particularly bad information from these new kind of emerging flows as well. And at the same time, although there might be kind of some new modalities and some different motivations, a lot of the information is actually quite similar to stuff we've seen before. It's technical cooperation, it's loans, it's that kind of stuff. So it can be kind of incorporated within these existing frameworks that kind of traditional actors, at least lots of traditional actors and big CSOs, for example, have begun to publish through like IATI. So the question, I guess, kind of is how important is it to have data on all these different flows and to see all these things together and alongside partner countries' own budgets themselves.
Mm-hmm. And last one.
Thank you. Matthew Martin, Development Finance International. There were questions that were posed to us for discussion in this session, and I wanted to provide one piece of evidence and then re-ask one of the questions, because I don't think we've tackled it at all. Why is IPF really important? One of the reasons I think it's really important is if you ask low-income countries and low-middle-income countries, they will tell you that it's their top priority for the type of development finance which can produce the results we need for the SDGs. We support a network of 28 low-middle-income countries, and we asked them that question. And I was quite surprised to hear that they preferred international public finance, development cooperation, if you want to call it that, over all of the other sources, and that in the turning to private finance in recent years was really an nth best solution as far as they were concerned, because they didn't think that public finance was available, particularly for things like infrastructure. But the question I wanted to re-ask, and building on Simon's comments about business as usual, I sat in an incredibly depressing session in the annual meetings of the IMF and the World Bank on financing for development, where essentially the message was we have goals which are 3 times as ambitious as we set ourselves last time, but we're not going to provide any public finance to support them. And we seem to have a level of complacency, or, I don't know, a level of nihilism about the possibilities for mobilising public finance, which is incredibly depressing. And yet, we're doing a lot better than we did after the last global recession. The last global recession in the 80s, aid levels completely collapsed across the world. We've managed to maintain them, to stabilise them, and we're saying they're going to stagnate, but we're not saying they're going to fall. Why can we not be much more ambitious? And the question that was for discussion is, what can be done to improve the enabling environment within donors? I'd like to know what can we do to get the political message across that we must stress the importance of international public finance. How do we get that message across? Because it seems to me otherwise we're heading for a meeting in Addis where we have no commitment to any money of any kind, and then the goals are doomed from the start.
Thank you. So we have 3 questions plus another one coming for Michael as well, which is what are the real trade-offs and financial implications of making the changes you've mentioned to the existing urban form. So we have 4 questions for Michael, and then one on data and on political will. We'll start with Michael.
I don't know whether to be flattered or insulted by the fact that most of the questions are for me. Let me take yours first, because it gives me a chance to clarify, which I possibly didn't. I didn't make it clear what I meant by this. What I was trying to say was that low carbon and climate resilient development now looks like a good development path, possibly probably a superior development path to a high carbon model for most countries, not for all, because of the multiple benefits that you get, one of which is avoiding climate change. That is a huge benefit, as long as other countries do it, but because of the air quality, quality of life, environmental and economic benefits. That does not mean that it's cheaper than, and I was not trying to say that it's cheaper or even just the same cost as a high carbon path in the short term. The evidence is that it is more expensive. It's more expensive both because climate change does add costs and because some of the technologies are more expensive. The calculation of the New Climate Economy report was that the infrastructure costs are probably around 5% more. You will likely to get much of that back as the operating costs of a lot of that infrastructure are less and so on, but it definitely has upfront cost. So I'm not in any sense trying to claim that it's cheaper. But that it could be, that it looks like a better development strategy, and so therefore there are reasons why countries may wish to do that, and indeed are now showing that they wish to do it, which are not just about climate change, but not that therefore it's cheaper. So then the second point I was trying to make is that you need to think about this in a completely integrated way now. You can't think of development and then add on a bit of climate, whether it's mitigation or adaptation. These are now these have to be integrated strategies because your climate impact, both your resilience and your emissions are bound up with the kind of development that you're doing, and it's not a separate thing that you can add on. And that's why the conceptual framework in which the politics of climate finance and the original conceptual framework of climate doesn't really work anymore. That's what I was trying to say. So we need development finance. We need finance for growth in different in countries, and it's got to be low carbon and it's got to be climate resilient. And so it seems to me these categories, once we've got over the next year's negotiation, should gradually fall away so that you have development finance and people and countries are asking for it to be low carbon and climate resilient, and so are donors. So that's the point I was trying to make. But we need more money. There's absolutely no question we need more money. The 100 billion is conceptually all over the place. I mean, it's not rational, but it's also definitely not enough, whatever it means. And we definitely need more money. And in answer to your point, the sums of money on the table are not sufficient. However, that doesn't affect, at whatever level that you have, to answer Romilly's point and other points, that doesn't take away the hard choices between alternative uses. And there are absolutely hard choices between alternative uses. Ultimately, for climate change, adaptation and mitigation are complementary strategies. You can't do only one or the other. If you only did one or the other one, you wouldn't cope with climate change. But in the short term, and also many mitigation activities have to be climate resilient. So there has to be an adaptation component to your energy system. You can't have an energy system that's at risk. Climate. Similarly, many adaptation activities also have some mitigation potential. A lot of climate resilient agriculture is actually lower emitting. All of that said, there is still competition between uses, as there always will be with limited funds. And we can't get away from that, and we will have to make choices. And the international community has adopted the easiest choice it could make, which is that 50% of climate funds should be spent on mitigation and 50% should be spent on adaptation. That is actually the only rational way of allocating the sums of money, because there are just competing priorities and so on. So we haven't got rid of the need for more money, B, the difficulty of making the choices between them. Let me just answer the point about the allocation per capita and then selling permits. In an ideal world run by a single utopian well-meaning government, that would be the solution.
Good. We have 3 minutes left, so I'll give a final minute to Gail, Romilly, and then Martin to answer the remaining questions and do their final remarks. So please, Gail.
Thanks, Nadia, and thanks for those questions. On political will, I sit in some of these discussions at the UN in New York, and I share your depression and sense of pessimism. I think the possibilities for large increases in international public finance are grim. I think we're likely to see not much more beyond a simple reaffirmation of the old and target of allocating 0.7% of GNI to ODA, and whether that remains relevant in today's day and age, I think is a very open question. I would say that target needs to be revised entirely. There's even resistance to sort of separating out a more accurate and separate reporting around climate finance and development aid. And I think part of the reason for the lack of political will is that, international public finance and development aid are rarely big vote winners with domestic electorates. And I think, and they're still poorly understood areas, I think, by many people. And I think we need to be much better and cleverer around building an evidence base and a narrative around the transformative potential of international public finance in the future, and start building that coalition of the willing. On data, very quickly, we have at the moment no independent mechanism for the monitoring and reporting of international public finance. There's just one important initiative by the OECD to monitor some international public finance flows from its members, specifically ODA and other official flows. But obviously that's incomplete, it doesn't include some flows, it doesn't include some donors, and it's also, the OECD DAC set the criteria for those measurements. It's not independent or impartial. So I think, let's try to get that into Addis, improvements in that area. And on fragmentation of the development finance architecture, increasing complexity, only likely to be more exacerbated in the future. Yes, I agree with that. And I think that's part of the reason why in our paper we made suggestions that we need to get much, much better and serious around the pooling of funds by international public finance providers and pooling them, building economies of scale and expertise, with bilateral programs increasingly playing a more complementary role. Stop.
Thank you.
Okay. In the interest of time, I'll just say three very quick things. Data, yes, couldn't agree with you more, unsurprisingly, because IATA used to be my life and soul. Maybe we need an International Public Finance Transparency Initiative. I don't know. It doesn't have such a good acronym. But I think realistically, it would be good to think about what is politically feasible on this. It clearly needs to happen. I know there's big issues around reporting of different flows, but if we could identify some really concrete proposals, I think that would be fantastic. On the political will, in a way, this is exactly why I think it's important to have these panels and to make this case for IPF, because, part of the story, obviously, is, we got all this private money, we don't need IPF, it's only in LICs, it's only in fragiles, therefore we don't need very much, blah, blah, blah. So I think it's about making that case for distinctiveness in order to get the additional resources, and I feel that that's an argument that we are not making at the moment, and we really need to scale up doing that. I think we need to make that case before we actually start talking about a scaling up, because otherwise everyone's going to say, well, why do you need this money when you've got private flows and so on. The last point I just wanted to make in terms of Simon's point, yes, of course, we absolutely do need a structural transformation when it comes to the climate. That's undeniable. The SDGs will also be about extreme poverty, and that is a shift from the last 15 years, which was about halving poverty, and it was actually easier, targeting the easier to reach groups. Now we're talking about the harder to reach groups, the most vulnerable, those in fragile states, as we discussed this morning. So let's not forget, when we talk about that structural transformation, that's important, but actually the extreme poverty goal is going to require quite a big change in how we do business as well. So just to add that into the mix.
About the issue of data, there's a very strong point there, and the difficulty to progress is due to political reasons. There's no technical or statistical problems, it's mainly political reasons. I will make a distinction between the international public finance and the South-South cooperation there. At least in Latin America, there's a clear description and very good data of the South-South cooperation going on there. What you don't have, because of a political decision of the countries, is monetarization of that cooperation. You know what is happening, you don't know how much money that costs. in regarding the international finance, you have to make the count bank by bank, and that's a very difficult work. But in terms of South-South cooperation, there are mostly political reasons. Just to mention an initiative, there's have been an open group working at the UNDESA environment. It's the core group of Southern partners. That's big countries of the South goes there. Brazil, China, India, Turkey, South Africa, Kenya, and many other countries. They have been meeting 3-4 times now. Obviously, Uruguay is not invited as a big country. It's invited as a coordinator of that Latin American group. So, but in the last ECOSOC, if you see the summary in one of the paragraph, it is mentioned the idea of making a global South-South cooperation report that was presented there in that group and with the group presented in the open sessions. So I will, if I were you, I will have a look at this process because I think in the near future it will have some results.
Thank you very much. Luckily, I'm not responsible for summarizing the richness of this debate. Simon Maxwell will be doing this tomorrow morning. So thanks everyone for staying until this late hour, and see you tomorrow.
Thank you.